Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's see if there are any questions
I have
before
a
we
quick
jump
question.
into a chart. Yeah, David.
Okay, so yeah, I realize almost any aspect of this you can go quite deep,
Yeah,
but
it's hard to break it down.
this aspect of ancestry and looking at your mom and dad. So, have you noticed something just like quite often we can find the moon and sun sign of people. That's easy, right? And pretty easy to find. So, have you found something that like in the parents in terms of how it connects with in the lineage, as you were saying, it's vertical in terms
Yeah,
of
yeah. Let me show you. I'll use Angelina Jolie's chart to show you that example. Okay,
okay,
'cause we know a bit about her parents, and then it's easier. That's why often you need a chart of somebody who you can trace, like they're.
right.
That's why
That's
the
what
royals often show up in these examples because we know who the parents were. Well, we think anyway.
right,
Um,
right. And
so
quite often when you're doing somebody's chart, they know their mother and father. They probably don't know their ascendant, but you can figure out their moon and sign quite often.
yeah, and it's not. Yeah, you often also have so much other information that you can go by that you can
Yes.
put all the pieces together.
Yeah, I
So
was thinking
we'll
about going backwards though, like
Yeah,
into the
that's
ancestry.
what I'm talking about. You
Oh,
can put
okay,
the
fair
pieces
enough.
together through the whole chart. Okay.
Yes.
I'll show you with
Okay.
Angelina Jolie. I'm
Nice.
checking on what my dog is doing, but I think she's busy downstairs. So we'll leave her for now. All right, let's
Okay.
have a look at, if there's no other question, we'll look at Angelina Jolie. And I think that can actually answer some of your questions because you'll see it kind of panning out in a chart. Okay. So unless there's something really specific, you can jump in and just unmute yourself.
Just
And
a reminder to start the recording.
yeah, did that. Yeah. As far as I can tell, I'm
I
recording.
did have a question, but it's not
Yeah,
very
go ahead,
specific.
Elsa. Yeah, that's fine.
But it's not specific to the ICMC or to the
Okay.
angles.
Okay, jump
So,
in. Let's see.
okay, I was just wondering about because I remember you said that Jupiter is can be the husband at the
Yes.
time that you were born, your mother's husband.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how that would
Jupiter,
plays out when.
Jupiter represents a lot of things, and actually, many features of the chart represent multiple things. And that's why it's really helpful to know the basics, know what is
Yeah.
Jupiter, what does that match, what are the symbolisms of all of these planets, what does the sign mean, what does the house mean, know what they are, really try and get really deep into that because you can put the different layers together according to the question. So if somebody is coming to me and they're telling me about some kind of family story, I'm not necessarily going to look at their Jupiter as their spouse, for example. Like it's not about the husband, it's about their family. So then the Jupiter starts to represent something more like the family status, their reputation. Were they wealthy when they were growing up? Did they have abundance? You know, all those things are Jupiterian as well.
Okay.
Depends on the question being asked in a way. Um, all right, so let's jump in and have a look at Angelina Jolie's chart. And we're going to see how her chart is expressing, especially because of the angles. So remember the angles. When I say angles, I mean the ascendant and the descendant, and I mean the midheaven and the IC. Okay. And so when we're talking about these placements now on the ascendant, we can see this quite literally for some people. When you have Venus on the ascendant, it's pretty likely that the person will be good looking. They may not be like your standard good featured person, but they will be attractive, we could say. And if it's a Venus that's in an unusual sign, like a place where she's not necessarily comfortable, Venus, say in Scorpio on the ascendant, she might be sultry and sort of mysterious. And there's this quality, and that will be for a man or a woman. I'm describing Venus here. So the attraction is could be like almost the fatal attraction. We'd want to see other aspects to sense that. But there's something, sort of sulfurous about that Venus. Whereas Venus in Cancer is quite maternal, dare I say. So her way of loving is to take care, is to be nourished. Now, remember that, especially with the chart, we're reading it backwards and forwards. So I'm hearing strange noises. And we're reading it backwards and forwards, meaning that what you think you want or what you're trying to do or how you're doing it is often an inner request. It's what I want, actually. I want to be taken care of. I want affection. I want my love to be nourishing. I want my love to be compassionate. That Venus Cancer. It's not necessarily what they got, you see, but it's also what they're trying to get. Venus is what I desire. Now, Venus on the ascendant will describe somebody who's very nurturing and maternal, but it's often coming from that desire. I wish I had this when I was growing up, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do more of it when I'm an adult now. Okay, so Venus on the ascendant, 99, like if I see that, or if I see Venus into the second house, they'll have a pretty face. Venus on the ascendant, they will be beautiful. The body's nice and they're attractive. And again, it's not necessarily in a traditional sort of, uh, typical way. They could be beautiful in a very unusual way as well. So Venus on the ascendant, this is Angelina Jolie. She's literally showing up as this beautiful creature. That's her. And she's known for that. That's part of her way of showing up. Now, her father was Jon Voight. So many of you may not know American Hollywood actors, but he was in the 70s when she was born, a really prominent actor in Hollywood. Very good looking guy, bit of a troublemaker, more than a bit of a troublemaker in terms of his personal life, but on the screen as well. That was his kind of way of showing up. And that was her father. And her mother was a model and a wannabe actress who didn't really act, I think. In the end, she didn't have that career, but was a very beautiful woman herself. So what we see here is also, remember, reflecting the parents, right? And here what we see is on the midheaven. Notice that these are partile. So this is another thing to notice. In a chart of somebody who is going to stand out in life, like either they're famous or they're making a mark or they have a real strong influence and impact on life, you will find things that are really strong in the chart. It's not like a wishy-washy sort of 8-degree conjunction. It's really strong. It's exact in her chart. We've got a within a degree conjunction of Venus on the ascendant and Jupiter on the midheaven. Jupiter in this case, remember, it can represent the reputation, right? It's the family reputation. And the reputation is, well, this is also the 10th house representing the father. We see the midheaven here in Aries. He went his own way, quite literally. He went his own way. And that also was his image on the screen. He was a dynamic kind of action figure in Hollywood. And also didn't stick around very long in the marriage. And that we see from the 12th house sun. Father was not there. Father was absent, and the 12th house is lost. Sun in the 12th house. I didn't connect with my father. And it doesn't mean that they're not loved. That has nothing to do with that they're not loved. It is that perhaps work is taking away the father, or travel is taking the father away from the home, or the father is just simply not there, including potentially, but we see it's not true in this case, that the father died. And there you would want to see a number of really hard aspects to the sun, really challenging placements of the planets related to the sun. Okay, before you would broach that subject. And so here, another way of saying that the father was not there is that the sun is in opposition to Neptune. So again, father's just not there. But and here's where we can look at, for example, the influence of the nodes, but we'll get more deeply into the nodes next week. The sun and the south node are, this is really a conjunction. The nodal axis has a 15-degree orb of conjunction. So this is technically a conjunction. Again, the closer, the more interesting, right? So this is still there. But what that suggests is that the father immediately had an influence on this person's life that was already there. The father was already an influence on this person's life. And that is how this person shows up. This is, my father influenced me heavily. But what is the overall influence? Not great. Not a really good role model, not really very clear, not really sure. The everyday obstacles are not necessarily faced, meaning that the Neptune on the North Node in the 6th house is not able to show up for work, let's say. And we know that he had a problem of drugs. He had a problem of alcohol. She has a problem. We see it in her chart, and we see his issue in her chart. Okay. We also see that Uranus is in a square to Venus and the ascendant. And Venus is ruling Uranus. It's ruling the IC and ruling Pluto, all of which are very influential. She's got Pluto opposite Mars not an easy aspect in a chart, especially when Mars is connecting to the moon. And the moon itself is in a partile conjunction with Eris, which is like the feminine Mars. It's this, so we see that there's a lot of dynamics that are uncomfortable here. Venus and the ascendant squaring Uranus is about not being able to be stable, not showing up in a way that is stable. What is not stable? The love is not stable. And in the sense of Angelina Jolie, that also for her represented a family life that was not stable. And what does she get in her life? She gets a family life that's not stable, and that is very different. It's also Uranus. Things are different. Pluto also in the fourth house. Intensity, for sure, to the point of passion and perhaps violence. And that's been suggested in terms of her parents. They had an early divorce. They didn't get along. And that's also her, you see? So this is describing her and her parents. She has Jupiter on the midheaven. So as a person, she's known, she's famous. She has a full 10th house and the midheaven in the 10th house, ruled by a very strong Mars in the 10th house, in the same sign, you see? So power, impact, the visibility, it's all there. And it's also belonging to her parents. Her mother was a model, her father was an actor. And they, although they weren't as famous as she was, she put it on steroids, but they were also in their day significant in their fields. Okay, and they were like a couple that everybody knew as well. So here we're getting, I just want to pause here for a minute to get the sense of this chart and understanding how we're seeing the role of the planets on the angles in a really specific literal way. Does anybody have a question around that? I see there was a thing.
Clara has a question in the chat. She has a question about how you read Rahu and Ketu on the angles as well, whenever it makes sense to answer this question.
Right. So I'm not going to answer this question at this point because it's not affecting this chart. And I want to look at things that are really specific to what we're looking at so it doesn't add confusion. So I will get to that. That has first house, seventh house, or whatever the angular aspect is in terms of the nodal progression, okay? The nodes are really for the next session. Because if we go everywhere all the time, we can only touch a little bit here and there on everything. I want to try and ground each week in something that you can feel like you're deepening. So with respect to this chart, yeah, please.
Can I ask, how do you make sense out of the moon being the ruler of the ascendant, but kind of overshadowed in this cluster of planets in the 10th? So
yeah,
how do
so
you
let's talk about the quality of the moon in Aries. So the moon not only is in Aries, but it's right next door to the ruler. So that's almost an 11-degree Mars. So that's within 2.5 degrees, let's say, of a conjunction with the moon. And Mars is really dominant. Mars is in its own sign. It's really, really powerful. And the one thing that mitigates that is that this is actually, well, I'll ask you, is this a day or a night chart?
So this one is a day chart.
Right. And so who is the malefic in a day chart? Who's the greater malefic or the relative?
Oh, no, Saturn.
Right. So where is Saturn?
So Saturn's in her first house.
In her first house. So this place, it's a heavier, let's say, we'll just weight it a little heavier. Meaning the weight or the authority that we give the planet Saturn is going to matter a little bit more in her chart than the Mars. Not to say that Mars doesn't, but just in terms of what is the problem, the bigger problem here, or let's say how does she work through her problems? Let's say it's more Saturnian. We'll get to that in a minute. But the Mars on the moon, it's never a nice aspect. It's never a nice aspect. We know that if we see this, we know that this mother, as a mother, her Angelina Jolie's mother was impatient or defensive or needing to be very independent. She might need to stand up for herself. So then the question is why? Don't puppy, push the door. Push the door. Now my dog, she's so spoiled. I'm going to go and open the door for my dog who can't do it for herself. Just a minute. Come on, monkey, in you go. All right. Oop. Right. I tried to train her to open the door for herself. Right. So the So the Mars on the moon, regardless of sign, is never comfortable. We're looking for how is it uncomfortable. And one of the dynamics is that there's a fierce independence when you have an Aries moon and Mars together. And then on top of that, we have Eris right next door. Now, we're not really going into those placements, but just to say, because I've put Eris here since it's almost partile again, Eris represents where we feel cheated or where we feel hard done by, where we feel we haven't been given respect or we haven't been given acknowledgement as a person, not fame or whatever, but it also is, it's going to point the finger of blame or hypocrisy. It's going to point out where you are a hypocrite. And in this case, where is she pointing to that? Well, it's the 10th house, it's her parents, the hypocrisy, the way that you show up. It's not exactly the way that you are. You see that Jupiter is with the Eris as well. And this maybe selfishness that can be part of the moon in Aries, this very bold way of showing up. It's an angular moon with Mars that's ruling it. It's really dynamic. These are angular, even if taking away all the rest of it, anything angular, like the Saturn is not closely conjunct the ascendant, but it's angular, really powerful, really, really strong. And so it adds to the dignity or the importance of these planets. And the closer they get to the angles of the chart, the more it stands out, the more it means something. And it's at the top of the chart, so it's public. We see this person. So she is a defender of causes, right? There's certain children's causes, and I can't remember what else she does, but she's been acknowledged as being a kind of ambassador, I think, for UNICEF or something like that, or similar things. It's not just that, but those kinds of causes. Now, the other thing about the moon Mars is that there can be, especially as moon is ruling the ascendant. So especially so when it is the ascendant ruler, we'll really start to personalize this moon now and say, okay, well, what does she feel like? Well, whoa, she doesn't feel so at ease. This is not a relaxed moon, right? This is a moon that is agitated, even more so because it's in the 10th house, because it's ruled by Mars, and Mars is very strong, even if it's not as strong as Saturn. But what we see here is she went through phases as a teenager and even in her adult life as she would be self-harming. The moon represents the body as well. And the first house is part of our appearance and our body. Tattoos, self-harming. She had 2 marriages before her marriage to Brad Pitt, and they were both dysfunctional. And I've forgotten the names of those people, but they were both famous in their own right as well. But also did strange things, like she kept the blood of her husband in a necklace or something. It was a little weird, like the things were they're not romantic, let's say, not romantic. And this is where we start to see, oh, wait, there's something else is going on here. This is Venus squared by Uranus. So Venus is expressed in a way that's a little weird, a little different, a little standoffish potentially, but also just not quite straightforward, not like you would expect it to show up, right? Because again, we're looking at partile squares, really strong. So all of these are exact aspects. She shows up differently, and also that's how she is emoting, or that's how she's coping or dealing with life as well. Venus being very strong as the ruler of that Uranus and in square. And then we have Chiron, which is not quite it's very close, but not partile. But Chiron is about where we feel wounded or damaged. And this is very, very strong in terms of both her parents' journey. They were going through hard times, not financially, but in terms of their marital status, in terms of their relationship never really worked. It was not a solid relationship right off the bat. And then again, we see that Chiron is squaring Venus and it's squaring the ascendant. She takes that to heart as well. So it's her parents' experience. This is all happening. This chart is her chart, but it's all happening before she's even born. It's all there before she's even born. And Chiron is squaring and saying, oh, we're kind of in a difficult relationship right now. Things are not easy right now. And there's an issue around our worthiness, let's say, in terms of the parents, and also in terms of course, her as an individual, and her in the eyes of her own parents, because we're talking about 10th house Chiron. right? So what she's getting, all of this stuff is describing her parents, and it's describing their status, their social status, and it's describing how she perceives her parents and how she thinks they see her. Okay, so Moon Mars, that's a heavy aspect. That's a crabby old woman. That's not a nice aspect. It's fierce. And again, it's like my question as a consultant, I would say, well, so why did this woman need to be fierce? What's going on that she needs to stand up so strongly? People are not born this way. I mean, people are born this way because Angelina Jolie was, but I'm saying in terms of the context she's born into, the mother needed something of Mars. She needed this aspect of Mars. She needed to defend herself. And in terms of the public, she also had to defend herself because, again, in terms of Hollywood fame and so on, she was the one who left her husband. There was something she needed to fight. Maybe it was the media she needed to fight, or maybe it was and here we do see that is part of her dynamic as a person. Now, that may have also been part of her original makeup. I don't have a chart for her, I don't know. But that certainly is the transmission that Angelina Jolie got. And so the complicated emotions, that's a psychological thing as well. Mars, Moon. The Moon is psychology, it's the emotions, it's our connection, our capacity to connect. Moon in Mars has a difficult time connecting. Moon in Mars is running its own show. I don't connect, I do my thing. You do you, I do me. It's not an easy connection.
Is that just the conjunction, or is that a square or a trine or a?
I'm only talking about the Moon in, let's leave even Mars away from this. If we have a Moon in a Mars ruled sign, or especially in Aries, it's I do me, you do you. I think about me first. It's always about me, and then I'll think about you. I'll remember that you're there. And any kind of Mars connection with the Moon is going to be somewhat manipulative. Because Mars is strategic, especially in Scorpio. Mars is a strategic energy. How can I show up in a way that I'll get my way? Okay, and then we're looking at Mars in a trine to Neptune, and we say, yeah, very likely there's some kind of a hidden agenda there. There's some kind of a strategy to get my way, let's say. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can also be a survival mechanism. Usually that is why it is there, but it also can be shown that this is me doing what I want because this is what I want to achieve. Am I making that clear? So it's only we haven't even added in the fullness of what the Moon can mean, and already we're looking at something that's not very easy. Then we add the ruler of that Moon right next to it, and we're like, oh, right, no, this is really, really tough. This is hard. And then that ruler is in a trine to Neptune. So she's probably not always sure why she's doing what she's doing. See? And that would, of course, describe the couple, the parents, and the mother particularly. The motivation. What is the motivation? It's emotional. It's status oriented. It's 10th house stuff, right? 10th house is about your social status. The midheaven is specifically that. So then points that are on the midheaven and how that shows up, it's going to be even more emphasized. So status mattered here in this couple, and it matters in her life. And look at this. Not only is there a partile conjunction with the midheaven and Jupiter, but it's also in a partile square to Saturn. So the square from Saturn to Jupiter is where there's an inconsistency. Things are not, especially when it's really tight like that, things are not necessarily going to be smooth. So the inconsistency is in what the person feels about themselves or how they feel like they should be responsible in general for life. For example, when we have Saturn in the first house, especially in poor dignity, because this Saturn is in the opposite sign of its rulership, right? So we have a Saturn in poor dignity. Jupiter has no particular, it doesn't mind being in Aries. It's fine. It's just that it can be a little bit hasty, impatient, out there, all the Aries qualities, but also inspired and enthusiastic and really fun as well, which she also shows it's also a quality. But then in a square to a Saturn in the first house, she probably felt as she was growing up quite isolated. And that would be her. She feels that way. Whether or not people were around her, we see that the parents probably were not fully embracing their roles, or if they were, it was with no small amount of resentment or frustration. We see that from the point of view of the mother. And we see that the father was, let's call it ambiguous around the relationship with the Gemini in the 12th house. And also there's, just a sense of he's not really there. We've got this opposition with Neptune as well. And so she's kind of doing things on her own. She's got to be on her own. She has to grow up fast. She has to take responsibility, but she's not really ready for that. Saturn is squaring the midheaven. She doesn't want to, first of all, and she's not ready for it. And this describes the parents in the realization, oh, we're having a baby. You see, we don't want this. We just wanted to have great sex. We didn't want this kid. We didn't want this baby. This is not really what we didn't really sign up for this. And how also can we find that? Is that the big story here at the time of birth, so before she's born and during her life cycle, is the story between family and responsibility, which is the dynamic between the Cancer ascendant and the descendant in Capricorn. The theme, each of those pairs have themes. So this is the theme. It's about family and responsibility. This is the big question around the time of her pregnancy and birth. And the freedom I want, the desire to go and do my thing, to be myself, to be different, to be like exploring the world, showing off, being famous. That's what I want. And this family relationship or the context of the family, which is about, do we do us? Like, can we stay together? Is this relationship good? And the relationship is affecting the home, right? The quality of the relationship affects the home. And we see, well, that wasn't really supportive, because we see that Pluto is there, it's retrograde. I mean, the outer planets are, let's say, 40% on average retrograde. So that's not uncommon, but it's a thing to notice. And both Uranus and Pluto are there in the 4th house, ruled by this Venus that's very prominent in the chart. So we see that the quality of the relationship is affecting home. And it's partly this dynamic between how does this relationship affect my life out in the world, and how's that working for me? And it really wasn't working for her parents, you see? So again, it's not about pointing fingers of blame. It's about understanding what was the context that this person is born into, and would that perhaps contribute to the fact that she herself can't have relationships that are easy to establish. You see, so there's a pattern that's here, and she's repeating this pattern. 3 different marriages, all of them explosive, all of them dynamic. The third one, there's no small, I don't know about the other 2, but there's no small dose of manipulation to get to that prize, let's say, the marriage. He was married when they started to, Brad Pitt was her 3rd husband, and he was married when they started to see each other on the movie set that they were working in the 10th house, right? So she's showing up in her 10th house role, and that's where this dynamic starts to show up in terms of relating. And there's no doubt their chart is extremely powerful. They were an extraordinary couple, but very because each individual had very complicated life stories and complicated emotional and psychological baggage. It's difficult to make a marriage like that work without putting in a lot of effort or awareness, let's say. Sonia.
I wonder there's a sextile between the sun and the moon, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. And it shows, and again, it's an exact, so again, we're looking at all of these features of this person's chart are exact. There's no doubt about these things. They're really, really prominent. And so that shows that there's a complicity between the parents, that shows that there is this desire, but a sextile is something that's harmonious. You have to work towards it. It's not a trine. It's not the same as a trine, which is flowing kind of naturally. It's just happening for you in a way. And so there was a harmony. I think there was a genuine, and I'm thinking in terms of her parents now, and this also describes her personality to a certain extent, that there is a basic attempt at harmony, let's say, within the relationship, and that describes her within herself, that she can show up in a way that's more or less balanced, but not entirely, because that sextile also includes planets that are in difficult positions, the sun in the 12th, in Gemini, ruled by Mercury, powerful, but retrograde, And with all of the psychological stuff that goes on that also reflects the fourth house, and the moon representing psychology, emotions, and so on, in pretty rough shape, let's say, strong, but in rough shape. So
So
although
to
it's,
remember, sextile is kind of like a potential that you have to kind
yeah,
of like work for, and
yeah.
the trine is kind of like it's given to you already, kind of.
It's, let's call it harmonious. Things can happen if you want them, and if you're working in that direction, things can happen. The question is, with reference to the ruler of the sun retrograding, and in the 12th, did he want it to happen? That would be the question. Did the father want this relationship? That's the question. Then it becomes part of her psychological makeup. So there's another aspect that's a layer of trying to understand what the dynamic was. It's not necessarily that there was, there was a tension, but it was not because they didn't try, or maybe they wanted to be with each other, but the situation was too complicated. For example, life on the stage here, literally, everything is taking place out in the public. Out there in the public. So here what we have when we have a sun in the 12th house, and a lot of actors have that, especially really successful ones, and it seems paradoxical because it's a place where we want to escape, we want to hide. We're quite shy. But it's because she's not being herself when she's acting. She's acting a role. When she's herself, it's not the same. She doesn't have the same way of relating to herself when she's out in the world, because she's playing a role. Even if she's on the red carpet or doing an interview, she's playing the role of, here's me as an actress. Who she is when she's in her private domain is different. And so that also can create a certain sense of insecurity around my identity. And again, the ruler is very important. The ruler is there in the 12th house retrograde. And it's not in any direct partile aspect to other planets. And that makes it interesting in and of itself, because it's not, you could say that it's in a trine to Uranus. It's a broad trine. Is it in the orb? Because trines have orbs of 7 degrees. It's just barely in the orb of a trine. Otherwise, that Mercury doesn't really aspect anything. Maybe Chiron as a sextile, which is not easy either. It's kind of a wounded Mercury, or Mercury that's able to talk about wounds as well, which she also does. She talks about difficult things as well. Mercury represents siblings as well, and it's very possible that there was some issues around siblings, because Mercury is not only in Gemini in the 12th retrograde, so there may have been a loss or some issue around children or siblings, again, in her family, before she had a family. And then it also rules the 3rd house of siblings and your extended family. Right, I think it was that. I think I answered that question. So unless there's something else, then we'll go to David.
So could you say with that tight 13 degrees with the sun, the moon, and I forget the other sign, the other glyph.
So that's Eris. Yeah,
Eris. With Eris there's some resentment in the mom for the father having a career and her not.
I don't know. Is it the career or is it the family?
Eris,
but we don't know. I don't know enough about the story. To be honest, I wish I knew more about the parent. But what is interesting here, and this is also part of this whole story, this whole dynamic, is that there is a lot of unconscious compulsive stuff with this kind of energy, with this moon Mars and Eris, for example, trining Neptune, which is close to the North Node. There's things that they aren't aware of as parents, and what she's not aware of as well. That's part of the dynamic. So what happens, as far as I understand her story, is that although she later in life really had to, later in life as a child, because her father left, he just left. She was estranged from him for decades. Then later, I think they started making movies together. He was in a couple of movies with her. But she didn't have a connection with her father as a teenager, as an older teenager and young adult. And she relied on her mother, but it wasn't necessarily an easy relationship either. So there's this dynamic with the mother that is extremely complex, that also calls in her own relationship to herself and herself as a mother.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the Eris connection with the moon.
Oh yeah. So Eris, as I mentioned before, Eris is where we feel things are hypocritical or where we've not been treated fairly, where things are. So I'm thinking the way I understand this chart is that the mother is left holding the bag. There's a resentment that
okay.
but is it because she wanted a better career? More probably because she didn't really want this role as a parent. Or
Well,
that she wanted it, but she wanted the husband to stick around and be there as a father as well. So there's definitely a feeling of anger. That's like astrology 101. There's anger, but also with the Eris, it's real resentment. And it's like, I'm going to show you. And that's one of the things that stands out with Angelina Jolie as well. When things started to turn sour with her relationship with Brad Pitt, then things started to go really pear-shaped for them. And what's interesting is that was they didn't get married. One of the reasons that she didn't want to get married for like the first 10 years or something that they were together was because she'd had bad experiences herself in marriage. And so they just stayed together. And for whatever reason, something, I think it was 2014 or something, they decided to get married. And as soon as they decided to get married, I thought, nope, this is when it's all going to go wrong. Then there's this whole unconscious baggage that comes up around commitment and obligation and duty. We're not choosing this anymore. We have to do this thing. So all of this energy starts to come through unconsciously. This is Neptune on the 6th house. I'm giving way more than you are. I'm doing way more than my share. You see it. So there's all of these things start to come out and they trigger. And that I think is when Uranus was crossing that 10th. So that would have been Uranus here and Pluto in the 7th just by transit. So that was triggering that in 2014. It would have been starting to trigger that Mars trine Neptune. So all of that to say that then that dynamic, which was original to her parents and to their story, reflects her life as well. And this is how we can see this is her psychology emerging, as well as the expression, the outer expression of her life. And we're seeing that not just from the angles, but how the planets are working around the angles. I'll just see if there's any more questions to come through, if there's something that needs clarifying.
Yeah, it's really interesting you're saying once they get married, that whole other commitment thing kicks in. That's really interesting to see in relationships in general. I really had that way.
But it only works
very happy until that point.
Exactly, because then they're unconsciously they're still free and they haven't chosen it yet. And if we see a chart like this, we see, well, whoa, the obligation is the problem. The marriage is the obligation. Issue. And that's where we see, oh wait, yeah, of course it is, because here we've got the Aries in opposition to Libra with problematic planets in these areas, which say, I want to go, I want to be free, I want my life, I want to do my thing. And this is too complicated for me, too heavy, too difficult. And there's an unsettled quality to this relationship. And then what that, of course, feeds into the ascendant Venus. And so that's Saturn in a square, partile square to heaven, partile square to Jupiter is also explaining this kind of feeling of the tension between the desire to do your own thing and the desire to settle down, the desire to be responsible, but resenting the hell out of it, because Saturn in Cancer is resenting family, resenting, I can't connect emotionally, I can't be. And now, is this a person who can genuinely connect emotionally? Not really. She can't really fully emote. She seems like a lovely person because she's got this capacity to turn on the charm, right? That's the public persona. But is that how she's really living it? No, not so much. We've got this Mars moon, makes her a little bit masculine as well. That's a masculine moon. And that's part of her charm as well. So she's got this kind of rough and tumble independent thing. It's like I think her first movie was Lara Croft.
Yeah.
But where she's like a warrior, right? She's a warrior, but what kind of warrior? She's sexy. I don't even think she wore clothes practically. It was like wearing a bikini, but I'm going to, and so this is Lara Croft right here, Eris, the moon, and Mars. You see? And so personally, that doesn't work so well. It's great on the movie screen, but it doesn't work so well. And so this is where the challenges come. So you can see, again, the more influential an individual, or let's say remarkable would be a word, because it's not about fame and it's not about financial success, depending on the chart, but it's about how noticeable or remarkable a person will be. You'll see that there's real exact things going on. They're really specific, exact, and powerful indicators in the chart that really jump out. This is not common, especially these are the two benefics on the angles. So a person like this, that, you know, this is a life of that she couldn't do anything but be famous for her appearance and for showing up dynamically in the world, right?
And Saturn is ruling her descendants. So this is what you said, like she's looking for in a person, in a partner, right?
She wants what? She wants responsibility and stability.
Structure, yeah.
Yeah. She wants the Saturnian figure. But what happens? No, I got to do this all by myself. I got to be that Saturn. I've got to be that. And that prevents the genuine receptivity of Cancer. When Saturn is there, we can't receive the love. And that's what she experienced with her parents. And that's what she, you know, even with Saturn, first house Saturn in Cancer, she had a double mastectomy based on a possibility that she might have the same genetic or same potential for breast cancer that her mother had. And that is it's again a kind of another form of mutilation, especially because even when she had that operation, which I think was like 2014, which may have been one of the instigators of the marriage. I can't remember how that all worked, but just to say, it's important to know a little bit about the person that you're describing so that you can verify with these things. So these details are a little hazy because I haven't looked at this chart for a while, but I know that the mastectomy and the marriage kind of came hand in hand. It came close together, but I can't remember if it was exactly the same year. And so that self-mutilation, that's also a part of the story. And what is it that's being mutilated? It's the breasts. It's literally that symbol of her womanhood and her motherhood. And that's already been there. It's been there in the past. She was cutting herself as a teenager. She was self-harming as a teenager. So it's interesting how these things keep recalling. They keep coming back. Yeah. So I'll leave it there and see if there's any other questions before we change charts. Is there anything else here?
Susan, can I just ask about Sun in the 12th house?
Mm-hmm.
You know, does that mean that somebody just openly expresses their unconscious without it? Like, do you know what I mean? Can it mean that you're so integrated into the unconscious that you can't inhibit?
The highest manifestation of that would be somebody who turns within. So meaning that they're consciously turning within. Otherwise, a lot of what happens is unconscious. And we see that already because the ruler is there in retrograde. And so there is a lot of unconscious stuff that's going on, and doesn't mean she can't later on get to it. And the South Node also tells us that there's an unconscious pattern that is at work, at least in the beginning of her life. And that unconscious stuff becomes, when it becomes conscious, becomes very spiritual. And I think that's part of her journey as well, that she has at least tried to go in that direction of self-awareness and understanding and so on. I know that there has been also a lot of alcohol, drug, and other stuff going on in her life as well. So that's part of the overall dynamic. But the 12th house is, it can be deeply spiritual. What is required is a consciousness, a conscious awareness of your intention, let's say, to go within and to use that energy. And she's known to be very private, which is, again, it comes by necessity because of the job, right? So she's very visible. She can't walk out the door. She couldn't go to McDonald's. She cannot walk out the door, right? And so this is also her father's situation. When she was born in the 70s, he was a famous actor. People would have known him, and he wouldn't have been able to do that either. And I suppose the mother also, by virtue of the fact that she was connected to the father, because I think she had more of a sense of fame because of the spouse. Here we see the moon with Jupiter, which for the mother is the husband, right? So it's also Angelina Jolie's husband, but it's also in the context of the mother's relationship, that's her husband. Her husband's famous. And so are Angelina Jolie's husbands. I can't remember the other actors' names, but they were also actors. They were famous.
Billy Bob Thornton.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know who the other one was, but it's not in the Brad Pitt category, but certainly they were known people anyway. So the sun in the 12th house for somebody, let's say an average Joe, not somebody who wants to be famous, is somebody who's quite happy to be on their own, keeping their own company, working behind the scenes, the accountant in the back office, or the person who is the set designer rather than the person on the stage. That's a really happy place, let's say, from a point of view of how a person expresses that. They're very happy in their own company, but she not so much, simply because of these tie-ins, you know, with the Mars, Moon, Eris. It's unsettled energy. And so there's a need for privacy, but it's not necessarily easy to be on her own because, again, that resentment seems to just pop in always, the anger, resentment, bitterness. The media portrayed Brad Pitt after their divorce as being highly problematic, but that's not even half the story, I'd say. A lot of it went to him. But I think, again, that there we see the Mars in a trine, almost, again, a partile trine to Neptune. And Neptune is ruled by Jupiter on the image. Why image? This is not entirely what it was. Things were not exactly as they appeared in the everyday life, 6th house of the expression of my life. And that, again, is how her whole life shows up. Things are not what you think in my everyday life. So, yeah, I think we'll leave Angelina for now. It's a good chart to look at in terms of the angles, so you can understand the impact that the planets on the angles can have. And here I want to look at, sorry to have to draw in politicians, but you know, they're famous people. So here we have Emmanuel Macron, and we have a chart where we have a midheaven way far away from the 10th house. So where's this midheaven? It's at the end of the 11th house, and it's in Scorpio, ruled by a Mars that's in the 8th. So there's something here that in Mars in the 8th, ruling the midheaven, with ruled by Leo, which is in the 12th, which is with a retrograde Mercury. Something always a little bit off about our dear Emmanuel. It's never quite clear what's going on with Emmanuel. He appeared out of nowhere. He came kind of literally out of nowhere. He had been doing it was what the French called an énarque, which means he's doing the École Nationale. He did all the Sciences Po, all the right schools. Like for the Americans, that's the Ivy League. He did all the right schools and so on. But it's not clear how he got to his political position. And there's a lot of backroom stuff going on here in this chart, especially because the 8th and the 12th are tied in to the 4th, and there's our Eris again. Something there that's not quite right. In his case, he had some difficulties with his parents, with his family. Both of his parents were successful professionals, and they were psychiatrists, which again is an unusual sort of launching pad, let's say. But 8th house can also be other people's money. And so let's say he was a banker and he was managing, which is a Mars word, managing other people's money. That's part of the rulership of the midheaven. The 11th house is about society, other people, connecting to other people. It's the house of gains. It's the world stage as well. So he's bringing out a part of an aspect of himself that, again, is very profound. It's very deep. We don't really ever really know what's going on behind those eyes. We never really can figure this guy out because he's not like an Obama type figure who's very out there, gregarious, very open and kind of jolly. There's some kind of a feeling of mystery and a feeling of people don't like him. Like if the average person, I mean, I'm sure he has friends, but the average person doesn't like him. They don't trust him. He gets a lot of backlash from people. And in fact, this is part of the significance, but I won't go down that road because I know some people get freaked out about this, but this is in my book as well. This is part of the book that I'm translating. These aspects, when you only look at the ascendant and the sun, if I look at nothing else in this chart that supports that, the quality that he's always off the mark. He always feels like he's being blamed. Even if he's done nothing wrong, it'll be him that seems to be blamed for everything. that his father, and this is another thing of that 12th house, not necessarily in the case of Angelina Jolie, because it was a Gemini, so that wouldn't have been as solid, but this father would have been quite strict. This is the Capricorn ascendant with the sun in Sagittarius. A strict father, a father that was, again, not necessarily present, not necessarily, supportive, you could say, psychologically or even physically present. And there's a lot about his past and his family that is mysterious, that we're not really sure about. And that, again, that comes from the Mars in the 8th, where there's a lot of family baggage, no doubt, and it's ruling the 4th house, where the South Node is with Eris. We also have, had an unusual relationship or difficult relationship with his mother. And it's where we find this very strong, again, partile opposition from the moon to Uranus, which suggests, again, mental or psychological instability. Not that he's mentally unstable in per se, but rather that there's a lack of stability, or there's a lack of trust that's built into his psychology. And so what that means, if we take it another step further, is he's still looking for his mother. And what does he do? He marries a woman who's like 24 plus years older than him. And so there's still this issue of security and trust that's there, that's quite strong. He's got a solid Jupiter, but it's retrograde. So that just means that there's something that's, again, not quite as it seems. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means things are not, the way I look at it, things are not exactly as they seem. And that Jupiter is distinguished, let's say. It's a distinguished family, a family that is not necessarily wealthy, maybe but it's more that there's it's an upright family, let's say. It's a family that is seen well by the community. The family is, they appear to be well off, or they appear to be a normal family. And then, of course, we have the Venus, also ruled by that Jupiter, and she's with Neptune, again in the 12th. So Venus in the 12th can be a little problematic, especially ruled by Jupiter. There can be issues of judgment or misjudgment or, secrecy. That's the 8th house, 4, 8, 12. When we look at that from the point of view of relationships or psychology or so on, we can also think of things that are not being spoken about, things that are secret, things that are happening behind closed doors. And so there's, again, this is the beginning of his relationship was not open. It was not able to be out in the open, and they got married many years after they started to be together. I think they finally got married. Let me check, because I put it in here in the details. Married on 20th of October 2007, and he was elected president on the 7th of May 2017. So I think that was also part of needing to actualize the marriage to be able to accomplish the goal. Venus rules the North Node. She rules the 12th house. I mean, the 10th house, where we have the North Node and Pluto. So he's driven. He's very ambitious. But what is driving him is not really clear. Maybe to him too, it's not really clear. So you see how the midheaven can go way off, but it's giving it, so the 10th house retains the meaning of the 10th house. It's still about the world outside. It's still about career and vocation and how I show up in public and so on. But the midheaven is specifically how I do it. It's got the flavor of how I do it. So he shows up and people are like, you're a bit of a snake, aren't you? We don't like you. We don't trust you. And why? Well, because there's part of him that stays hidden. Part of him, it's ruled by the sun in the 12th, and Mars itself is in the 8th. So there's something that's not entirely out there. And the Jupiter, although it's distinguished, it's retrograde. So there's something also that's being a little held back. And that may be one of the ways to describe him. He can't, if you think of again, as an alter ego, if you think of somebody like Obama, who was very gregarious and very social, very easy to get along with, even with people who he didn't get along with in terms of politics, but he could get along with everybody. Very outgoing person. People actually liked him as a person, even if they disagreed with him. This is not true of Macron. People don't like him. and they don't know him because they genuinely don't know him, but they don't like him, but also because of what he does. So, and he has been accused of making backroom deals and jobs for friends and all the usual political stuff. And this is all the more reason that he is shows up in that way in his career. So that's part of what that kind of Venus quality is being brought out into the 10th house and into the North Node and Pluto conjunction, which can be described as ruthless ambition, but it already is there if we have this combination between the Sagittarius sun and the ascendant in Capricorn. You can think of that anytime you see a chart like that this person potentially, and it has to be proven by the rest of the chart, but this person will show up and get to where they want to go regardless of what it takes to get there. That's the ruthlessness of this combination. And Saturn we have in a retrograde motion at the beginning of the 9th house, trying to get back into the 8th house, and Saturn is there in Virgo. And so again, there's this kind of tension with the father, and it's 9th house is the father. And there's perhaps also a bigger story with something to do with siblings, and there's a mystery around his siblings, an unusual story. Somebody tracked down his supposed brother, and his brother said, no, he's my cousin. So there's something strange about the whole family situation. It's not clear. And we won't even get into the wife, but there's something that's not clear about this person, and it's expressing in his public persona. Right, so that's an example of the midheaven being way off the axis of the 4th and 10th. Before I continued, are there any questions about this chart or anything that's not sure? Again, the Chiron reaffirms this feeling of finding it difficult to show up as I am. So then the question becomes, well, why? What's going on that makes it difficult to show up as you are? Chiron is not in a partile square, but it's in a square to the ascendant, on top of the fact that he is not sure of how he can be himself or how he shows up, and even in terms of the connection with Taurus, it's my value, right? Or my sexuality, for that matter. There's some stories about him, and we won't go into those, but there's stories about him as well. Denis, yes, please. Yes. Oh, here maybe Denis, another European, might have a good angle on Emmanuel.
Yes, just curiosity if you see in the chart with the moon being the mother and maybe the wife not being a woman.
Yeah, this is the other question that can be one thing to investigate, which is about sexual deviation. Mars is there, retrograde in Leo, the 12th house Venus with Neptune, the Mercury retrograding into the heart of the sun. So when so Mercury, Sun, Kazimi, we're having one today, actually. Things can also be hidden or not clear. And especially in the 12th house, it's not clear to the individual. There's a lack of clarity, or there's a lack of open, it can't be open, perhaps something hidden, something that can't be spoken about. And there is some indication, there may be an indication that he grew up or was at least influenced by some kind of pedophilia connection. Obviously, the woman who he ended up marrying was 39 and he was 14 at the time that they started their relationship. So that's a problem in and of itself. And then with the moon here in opposition to Uranus ruled by the Mars in the 8th house of psychology and what is hidden and what is potentially deviant. And I'm only saying that it's not necessarily so, but I'm saying that because there's this other dynamic here of Mars squaring Uranus and squaring the moon, but also ruling the ruled by the sun, and the sun in the 12th. Mars is broadly trining Neptune. And again, so there can be things that are unclear about motivations or unclear about one's actions. That can also be very spiritual. It can be, all of these things can be turned around to be used in a conscious way that makes one extremely spiritual, emotionally detached in order to be more spiritual, for example. But it's also 5th house stuff you want to equate with sexuality or sex life and this kind of thing. And with Venus in the 12th, it's sometimes, not always, but with this particular chart, one wonders there's a strong sense of hidden relationships, relationships that can't be spoken about, relationships that can't be exposed, for example, to the public. That's the 12th house Venus, ruling his 5th house.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a strange story, and also ruling the 10th, the house of how he shows up to the world, which again is part of his issue. He's got this Pluto North Node. People find him too much. He's got. It's interesting because he's the youngest president that France has had since Napoleon, and a lot of people accuse him of having this kind of Napoleonic complex, meaning he's got this grandiosity that people don't like. That's part of the having a so-called good Jupiter, strong angular Jupiter retrograding, but ruling all of this stuff in the 12th, where the Sun itself is ruling the 8th, and the Mars that's in the 8th is ruling the 4th. So there's a lot of psychological stuff going on here. Mars is trining the South Node that it rules as well as trining the Eris. Remember, Eris represents that feeling of not being seen or respected, not being seen or valued. And we know that he didn't grow up in an easy home. I think his grandmother raised him rather than his mom. And that also is a reference to the Neptune in the 12th, the grandmother having a lot of importance. Neptune in the 12th house can show a grandmother that has a lot of importance in a person's life.
Would you say that in this case, for example, because the MC is not in the 10th, and in his example, it's nearly exactly sextile to the ascendant. Does that has a different ring? Like if
Sure.
it's
Yeah, it also feeds into the notion of that ambition, right? He's very driven, very ambitious. We see that already with this combination here. There's a strong ambition, but what is the drive for ambition? Well, there's an inferiority complex. So there's a feeling of my father is disappointed in me, or I can't connect with my father, and so that Saturn in a square to the midheaven becomes part of the motivator. It's part of how one is trying to be seen. You could have any planet square to the midheaven. It's where you start to, like if you've got Moon square midheaven, you worry about how other people see you. You worry about how other people feel about you. If you have,
more because it's a day chart, right? Because the Saturn is more important.
Saturn is the bigger, greater malefic. Yeah, but Mars plays a big role because it's there in kind of, because it's also being ruled by the Sun itself. Mars plays a very strong role as well. So also it adds to that feeling of it's not really acting, not only is it retrograde, it's in the 8th house, and it's acting from this place of things are not exactly clear. Again, Mars is squaring the Moon as well, squaring Uranus. It's unpredictable. Motivation is unpredictable or unclear, perhaps. Yeah, so Saturn in the house of the father, that I feel very, over all the years, I feel like the parents are in the 10th house, or the social conditioning can also be the 10th house, family image and so on. But the father specifically, in the same way as the Indians look at it, father in the 9th house, it gives you a lot more nuance about the father. And then the mother typically in the 4th, unless you start to see indications that the mother's out of the house or that she's doing something else. In this case, I think that his mother was a child psychologist. So we've got the Moon in the 5th house. And but she also specialized in and connected with other practitioners around, I think she was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. I'm not sure anymore, which also explains the Uranus connection in opposition to the Moon. But also it seems like she had some kind of connection to transgender people, young transgender people that she would counsel. So there's a bigger story than just our story about his wife, but there's a story that already is there in his family, in the parents' jobs, in their profession, which is psychiatry. And I'm pretty sure, but one was a psychologist, one was a psychiatrist, or working in those domains. And the mother was working, maybe she was working more like a psychologist or a social worker, but to help people who wanted to have transgender surgery. And So the story is quite complex. And this we see this with this chart as well. It's not easy. Things are complicated. Things are in the hidden aspects of life are very, fourth, eighth, and 12th house. There's a lot going on in the interior of the person or in the hidden life of the person. We don't really see what's going on. All right. So I think it's getting a bit late to add in another chart. So maybe we'll just maybe leave it at that for now. I'd like to do more charts. So in a way, for next week, when we talk about the nodal axis, I think I'll do that through charts rather than doing the separate presentation about the nodes, because I think you'll also learn a lot about the nodal axis by looking at the charts. I find it sticks better when you see the example directly, I hope. So are there any questions to finish up with this particular chart or with this concept of looking at the angles and how they tell you something?
I have a question, but it's not specifically about the angles. It's just about the diurnal benefic
Mhm.
and malefic, sorry. I'd written down when we did it that it was Saturn was the nighttime malefic and more constructive in the day. Have I got that wrong?
Yeah, it's still malefic. It's malefic either way, but it's
But
less
it's worse at night. It's the
right. It's more, let's say the bigger trouble will come from the out of sect malefic, let's say. So in this case, it's a day chart. So Mars is going to cause more trouble. Saturn will be actually a tool he can work with.
right. Well,
But the bigger trouble comes from the out of sect malefic. And also, let's say the least benefit comes from the out of sect benefic. In this case, it's Venus in the 12th.
brilliant.
And
Thank you.
yeah, and so we see also that his family, one of the ways of seeing that Jupiter in Cancer on an angle is that the family relations were beneficial to him. So he was able to achieve something based on family relationships or based on the family situation, you could call it, like his privilege, let's say, that was benefic for him. All right, so we see that also part of his problem overall in terms of his relation with the public and his position as a politician is around money and relationships. So that's that Venus aspect as well.
Why would Neptune in the, I'm sorry, why would Neptune in the 12th house be a grandmother? Like,
That's a symbolism, that's a signal. Neptune in the 12th is often seen as a grandmother or some kind of usually it's a grandmother type figure in the lineage that really helped the person, and including if the person didn't know them, that the grandmother is there kind of as a spiritual guide or a spiritual support. His grandmother was like a mother figure. She was a very influential figure in his life. His mother was not really there. We see that with the moon in opposition to Uranus. Mother's just not there. She's too busy doing her thing. She's distant, can't connect with the mother.
but that's specific to Neptune in the 12th house, right? So it's not Neptune, period. It's just Neptune in the 12th
It's
house.
specifically Neptune in the 12th. It often indicates that important role with the grandmother. That's really like the person will somehow be personally connected to this grandmother story, whether that be that they influence their life in general, or often it's somebody who's actually been extremely bonded with the grandmother. Does anybody here have Neptune in the 12th house?
I have it right on a very first degree of Capricorn. I'm Capricorn rising, but I have also prior my rising Neptune, Uranus, and Saturn. And I remember you mentioned its ancestors.
Yeah. So your grandmother plays a big role in that.
She raised me since 7 months
Yeah.
old. Yeah.
So
I have that also.
Oh, you have that too. Was that David that just said that?
Yes.
Was that the case for you, David? That your grandmother was playing a big
She babysat sometimes for sure because my mom was working.
right.
And Neptune in the 12th house, and Saturn on the ascendant.
Right.
Very close.
I've also got that.
Who's that? Who just said that?
Georgia. Well, I've got
Georgia,
it
you
on-
got that.
I've got 0 degrees Capricorn and my ascendant's 3 degrees.
Oh yeah. And so your grandmother was big influence in your life as well?
Funnily enough, I I never felt that close to her, but she
Okay.
said she felt a special affinity with me out of
Right.
all the grandchildren.
And
One-way
so
street.
this is also part of that dynamic, which is like the sort of guardian angel kind of energy, you know, she's like your spiritual guide or your spiritual what do you call that? Yeah, spiritual teacher in a way. Teaching you let's say important stuff, you know, the invisible stuff, like the Petit Prince says, all the important stuff is the invisible stuff, and that would be that quality of that grandmother, or ancestors in general, but especially if I see that, I'm always going to say to somebody, was your grandmother important to you? And especially because also the ruler of that is Jupiter in good dignity in the seventh, in a minor loss of dignity because of the retrograde, which again just means that it's not operating from this place of all systems go. There's something that's being held back. So again, we see that with the family, that there was, you know, it was all fine, but we're not going to hug. We don't do the thing, you know, we're not really fully there. The father apparently was quite demanding, and so on.
Would Jupiter be in the 12th, be like the grandfather?
Jupiter in the 12th is considered to be overall protection from ancestors. So it could be grandfather, it could be, you know, usually the Saturnian figure would be a grandfather figure. Maybe Saturn in the 12th could be an influence from a grandfather, and it would be positive or negative depending on the quality of that Saturn. But Jupiter in the 12th is like overall ancestral, either connection or protection, and that kind of sense of being protected. It's considered to be also a similar to the Neptune, but more in the sense of general spiritual guidance or protection.
My Jupiter is also in the 7th, so
Mhm.
my both maternal parents raised me together, and they passed away on the same day.
Oh.
Wow. But
Ah, right.
yeah.
Both maternal grandparents raised you.
Yes, they took me in from 7-month-old. Mom
Wow.
went working, and
Yeah. 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 So what would be interesting for next week? For again, the homework is really for you, obviously. Like I'm helping to reflect back to you what you're saying to me. Please send it in by Friday. Friday is not Saturday. I won't look at it if it comes in after Saturday. I just can't because of the way my Saturdays are. But do it for yourself and just try now this time for the homework. Analyze your chart, but you're looking, and now we're looking at all of the chart. We're still for the moment going to give, you can give some importance to the outer planets, but don't start with them. Always go from the rulerships first, then add the outer planets after, as an add-on, let's say. But I'd like you to look at your chart from the perspective of your parents, how your parents' experience is described in your chart, and then have a look at how that has affected you, how it shows up in your life. All right. So you're analyzing the chart based on, if I'm looking at this as my parents' experience of life, how is that showing up in my chart? What must they have been going through? And how is that showing up for me as well? All right. So you're looking at yourself from this big picture, an extension of you before you're even born. And you're seeing, what is the parental dynamic that I have absorbed and that's showing up now in my life? Is everybody clear about that? To be sure about the homework? Yeah, Cheryl?
Excuse me. I was wondering if regarding the parents, if their son, their own son's position, their star sign, would correlate in your chart.
How the sun
Their son
shows up in their, so he would show up in their chart for sure. Like the way that his influence on their life would be in their chart.
Yeah, I know. And what I actually meant was, like, for example, my mother was a Virgo, and that's in my 3rd, or Virgo is my 3rd. Would that correlation have an effect on my childhood.
Well, all of it sure
signs
would.
in Virgo.
Yeah, all of it would, but it would depend on the quality of the Virgo. Where's Mercury? What is there in the chart in Virgo, or what's your mother's aspects of Virgo? So it's there's no specific direct correlation. We have to see still what's the nuance of both charts and then fit them together. And so yeah, there's like we were saying earlier with Noreen, the family overlap is usually really strong. There's usually something really quite significant, and it will describe the circumstances the parents were going through or the thing that was happening in their lives. Like if I take my daughter, for example, I'm Cancer rising, I have a Aries midheaven and Aries 10th house. And when both my children were born, Venus and Jupiter were in my daughter's case, in my 10th house, changing my social status, adding to my social status. Venus rules my 4th house. Jupiter represents children. And Jupiter is the ruler of my 9th house, where the stellium of my planets are, for example, and it rules my 6th house of everyday health and well-being. And her sun is on my Mars, and her moon is on my sun. And so the day that she was born, I had to have a cesarean section. And it was the first time I ever had an operation, the first time I ever had anything medical done to me. And that shows in my transits for me, but it's her chart as well. And it's showing also my change of status with the Venus and Jupiter in my 10th house when she was born. So that's me and changing my life, but it's my daughter's 8th house because she's got a Virgo rising. And then when my son was born, Venus and Jupiter happened to be in Cancer, and they're in my 1st house. So again, it's another symbol of something changing, me changing. I'm expanding my sense of self, and all of those different dynamics. With my son, after he was born, I nearly died. And so there's a square from Pluto to the moon. And that square from Pluto to the moon happens to be from the 6th house. Pluto was in my 6th house. And so that's something that is, you'll see it repeated in generational charts. And it's very interesting, if you know your family dates of birth, to put them all together and really start to look at this ladder that is created where people are interplaying in a really powerful way. Maybe if we're not looking at, well, I'll just check if we're looking at this chart. So yes, we definitely have a look at your ancestors and children as well. So James, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually had a question about Macron's chart. So if other people have questions about the homework, maybe you can come back to it at the end.
Well, let's finish off the chart and then we can come back to the homework in a minute.
Okay. You discussed the MC sextile, the ascendant. Can you discuss the IC sextile, the descendant, and how that might make sense?
Yeah, so the IC is how he feels about his life. That's the IC, and his, what you can call his arrière-boutique, or his home. It's like what makes him feel comfortable, what makes him feel secure, let's say. And that's sextiling the descendant in Cancer, ruled by the moon that's in Taurus. That recalls back this 5th house, this thing of the security, the maternal story as well. And 5th house also being what brings him joy and fun and expression, self-expression, which is a little bit held back, but which is also Chiron in a square to the ascendant, and also sextiling Jupiter. So there's, with Chiron, even if it's a soft aspect, it can be a little tense, it can be a little difficult. But then so the story for me would be that his relationship is bringing him a certain amount of solace. It's bringing him the thing that he wanted. It's the mother that he wanted to find, or that's the comfort or the emotional security that he wanted. That's not necessarily easy or available to him. But notice that he's a politician, and politicians are all about relationships. It's all about the handshake. It's all about connecting. It's all about, so though the descendant represents all relationships, not just the marriage partner, but how he connects with people. And so in this sense, with the Cancer, he connects in a way that might feel like he's taking care of somebody, or that he's bringing you into his fold, let's say, or he connects with people in a way that feels homey and nurturing, or at least he thinks so, but it doesn't come across that way. It doesn't relate that way, partly because of all these other things, the Chiron square and this moon. His emotional nature is not entirely trustworthy or stable. Cancer there also with that connection to Chiron can be the descendant ascendant axis there, can be a little needy, emotionally needy. So that can be another way of that showing up. So these placements, the sextiles and squares and all of that between the midheaven and ascendant, I put after the relationship from the planets to those points. It's not as important. It's extra information, but it's not going to give you enough information. So you want to start then looking at what's going on with the ruler, what's going on in competition between Mars and Saturn. Well, we saw that there's something a little bit off in both relationships. There's something a little bit uneasy. Mars in the 8th house is retrograde also with the ruler in the 12th. There's something perhaps a little perverted that can be, again, I'm extrapolating here because of all of the difficulties that these planets are happening, having the square, a retrograde Mercury ruling a retrograde Saturn, this Mars is retrograde, Jupiter is retrograde. It doesn't mean that retrograde is necessarily always going to be nefarious. It means that something's a little off, that you have to question, why is this not smooth sailing? Why is this? Because these are planets that are personal planets, Mercury, Mars. Saturn is more frequently retrograde. Jupiter is always once a year retrograde. But the way that they relate to each other is very specific. That's a sextile between Jupiter and Saturn. So yeah, Saturn itself is trining Chiron. So again, we see this wounding around the father, wounding around authority figures. It's not an easy home life, or not an easy start. And again, we see the issue with the siblings. Saturn is trining the Sun and Mercury as well. Something funny about the siblings. All right. Is there any other question about Macron, or will we move to the homework or whatever? I think it's Yvonne next.
That trine is an easy situation, though, isn't it? Between the
Well,
Saturn and Mercury.
Yeah, yes, but it's retrograde Saturn, retrograde Mercury, and it's Saturn. So it's like, yes, it's easy, but what is it? It's discipline. It's like, it's not like, it's discipline. This whole chart says, I got to work hard. I have to earn my parents' love. I have to, be a success. I have to be, this is also the Pluto North Node in the 10th. I have to be a success. I must be successful. There's just no alternative.
And he's thinking about it all the time with the Mercury there, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say so. And that's also, again, another indication of a really strong influence of the father, trining Saturn, Mercury, who's ruling Saturn, and then in this Cazimi. This is kind of just moving out of Cazimi. So it's still, it's still a really strong conjunction. The interesting thing about Sun-Mercury conjunction, when you have people who have a tight Sun-Mercury, or even a little bit looser, a couple of degrees, often they don't have an easy time listening. And this can describe his father, or communication with them can be difficult. They talk about themselves. They're not listeners. They're not, there's too much of a focus on the self. And we do see that with Macron. He's not people can say whatever they want, but he's going to go his way. He's not really listening. Have an election and then decide anyway on the government that's going to stay, for example. So you see, there's a certain way of understanding both the father and the personality that emerges from that and how it manifests in his life.
Is that because you weren't heard by your father, or is it some other meaning because of it?
Is it because of what? Sorry?
Because you weren't, just going back to the ancestral part of it, is it because you weren't heard by the father? So
that's what I'm saying. His father can also be described this way. So the father's not listening. The father doesn't his father is all about the father as well. Father focuses. Remember, the father's a psychologist. That's 4th, 8th, and 12th houses are a lot to do with psychology, psychiatry, all of those things. And so it's, Jupiter as well. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. I already know. Don't tell me. I know the answer. That's Macron, 100%. I already know. Don't tell me. I'm not listening to you anyway. And that would describe his father for sure. Right. All right, let's move to the next question. We've got Yvonne.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm going to have to say goodbye right after the question. I'm not sure about my father's birthday. He may be a Sagittarius, he may be a Capricorn, because in Poland, people born in late December were often transcribed as being born the following year in order to in order to skip the military draft for a year.
Oh, okay.
Same thing with my brother. So I don't know my brother's birthday really, but they were transcribed as January 3rd and January 4th. My father, who's probably born on the 18th, maybe on the 19th of December, is he a Sagittarius, or
It
is
depends on the
he
year, because the signs switch over year by year at a slightly different day. Could be 19 or 20 that it shifted into. I don't know. I would really need to have a birth time and a date.
impossible?
So yeah.
Okay. So in these cases, I mean, sorry.
Then
So
I
I'm
do
really,
then I just do a straight up solar chart. I just take the sun as it is from the day of the person's birth. If we don't have a time, we can't know more than that. We just take the sun as it is on the day.
okay. All right.
And then you give what is called the hypothetical chart. Some people prefer to do noon, put the sun at noon. I prefer to do it at sunrise, so the sun comes into the first house.
Okay.
We have a new student. Hello. All right.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Elsa, last question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to that question, sorry, about the husband and just to understand, what does the
In
husband
this chart or in general with the Jupiter question? Meaning this one or the Jupiter?
No, I actually don't want to ask about Jupiter. I didn't I sort of wasn't asking the question properly. I just wanted to ask sorry, I lost my train of thought now.
So you
But
started out, I interrupted you and I'm sorry. So you started out saying I had a question, I wanted to ask you a question about the husband. So
yeah, but I meant more so from my mum's point of view, I guess. Does the husband have to be my father in like my
well,
dad?
it's your chart, so it's describing the moment of your birth. Her husband would be in your chart, so meaning that whoever she's married to is in the chart. That would be normally it's the biological father. If there's a doubt around
Okay. But it doesn't really have anything to do with marriage and actual sort of
yeah, it
ceremonies.
can. Like, for example, if we look at Macron's chart again, from his mother's perspective, the Jupiter also represents her husband. And so we see that she sees her husband as a nurturer, as somebody who's resourceful, he's family oriented, he's good provider, let's say. It's Jupiter in Cancer, it's highly distinguished Jupiter, exalted also in an angular house. So that's how she experiences the Jupiter before he's even born, you see?
Okay.
So if we extract you from your birth chart, it's your mom's experience of the husband that is in your Jupiter.
But what if there was like another partner involved?
Then we have to look at the whole chart, because it can
Okay.
also be, there can be something to do with an issue around, say, I don't know, could it be Mars or Saturn or something that has to do with another relational question? Typically speaking, that's considered to be the husband, but it can describe a lover as well. And then we would look for 5th house, 8th house stuff, 12th house as well. Hidden things that are not entirely clear, especially 8th house things. When there's a Jupiter in the 8th house, there's some kind of maybe a tendency towards things that are not entirely above board, sexually or in terms of the dynamic of the relationship. Not always, but it depends on the quality of the Jupiter as well.
Okay.
All right. Okay, I think we can get rid of Emmanuel here. So just seeing if there are any last questions. Does anybody have a question for me at this point? We've gone way over time. So what I suggest then is you have a stab at your homework. Remember, the focus is that you're looking at what was going on in your parents' life when you were in utero and born, around that time. So around the energy of the moment that you were coming into this lifetime, what was going on in your parents' life, and try and understand that. And maybe some of you have a lot of information around that, and some of you might have to do a bit of guesswork. But notice how it's showing up in your chart, and then notice how it shows up in your life as you've experienced your life. How do those dynamics repeat, just as we saw with Angelina Jolie? Okay. There we go. We're getting closer to putting everything together. So I think all of you are just exhausted. Fair enough. It's a lot of information, but it's also, it's not an easy subject, right? It's something that requires a certain amount of time and thought, because we're talking about an individual, we're talking about a person's life. So we want to try and get to the core of understanding. The way I do my readings in the natal astrology is to try and understand, how did a person become this way? Because people are not born in a particular fashion. They're created in so many ways. It's partly karma, but it's partly how they were shown what it means to be married, or shown what it means to be loved or not, or how many times were they betrayed emotionally by their own parents, for example. All that will show up in the chart, and it will cause the person to be as they are. Right? If you have Mars in the first house, for example, for me, I look at that, and if you look at it only from a point of view of psychology, you would say, oh, this person is really assertive, or even aggressive, or very selfish, and really strategic, or driven, or whatever the Mars symbolism is there. But I look at that and I say, well, why does somebody need to defend themselves? If Mars is in the first house, it means that something's going on that's not safe, and that they were either needing to protect or defend themselves, or there was something happening to them physically that was actually not safe. And then you start to look to support that hypothesis. So you see this, people don't randomly show up as difficult people. It's a bigger story. All right, so we're going to try and find your story in your parents' story, and then see if you can work your way through your own experience. All right, so if there's no more questions, then I will leave it at that. I'll try to upload all of these videos to the platform, and then again, if there are any difficulties with the platform, let me know. Okay, and any questions, please email or put them in the WhatsApp group. So don't wait, don't hesitate to ask questions. Good. All right, everybody, see you then next week, and we'll have a look at the nodes and see where that takes us after all of this stuff. All right.
Sounds good.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.